only a few of you put up your hands in response to that, which I find kind of surprising because the general consensus among a lot of people on the street is that humans are done evolving. This is over. We're finished. We have culture and technology, and that's taken over. But human evolution as a whole is done. And you would be in good company. Stephen Jay Gould, one of the preeminent evolutionary biologists of the 20th century, was definitely in this camp. You can see I managed to cut off the top of his head here. Ernst Mayr, another very prominent biologist, and they both had strong words on the subject. Gould said, "There's been no biological change in humans in 40,000 to 50,000 years. Everything we call culture and civilization, we've built with the same body and brain." Mayr said, "Something must have happened to weaken the selective pressure drastically. We cannot escape the conclusion that man's evolution towards manness suddenly came to a halt." You'll have to forgive me, he was writing about the 60s or 70s, so gender-neutral pronouns weren't his forte. So, I'm sorry for this. We turned off the lights, it's really hot in here. I won't be offended at all if you fall asleep halfway through. It's okay. So we're left with the question, are humans still evolving? I'm going to attempt to address this tonight. My name is Steven Hamblin. I'm a postdoc at the University of New South Wales in the School of Biotechnology and Biomolecular Sciences. I am an evolutionary biologist, so this is kind of in my wheelhouse. So what I'm going to do tonight is try and present a few... The problem with a talk like this is that I have to pitch it to a wide variety of audiences. So I could have easily written an entire book on the subject, and many people have. Actually, there's some really good books out there, and if you want suggestions, feel free to ask me later. But I'm going to touch on a few key highlights to try and convince you that this is actually still the case, that humans are still evolving. And I don't mean in the Hollywood fashion, right? I'm so sorry to tell you, none of you are going to sprout wings in the next 20 minutes, right? Or ever, frankly. Wouldn't actually mind me a pair of wings, but so not in this fashion. But we are still evolving, right? We have evolved recently. We are continuing to evolve now. And I'm going to try and convince you that even if technology finally catches up with us at some point, it won't be in the short term. But that's a little more speculative. I'll get to that at the end. So for the purposes of this talk, I'm adopting a particular definition for evolution here, which if you have a grounding in biology, will ring familiar, but may also piss you off. I adopt the definition for this talk of evolution being a change in gene frequencies in a population from generation to generation. You might recognize this as being pretty much from the population genetics playbook. Or if you have no idea what I mean, that's okay. But this is the grounding that I'm talking about. So we'll see this come up again. And in particular, I'm talking about all of the evolutionary forces that affect us as humans and others. Sorry, can you see?
Yeah.
When we say are humans still evolving, the question is a little loaded, right? By the strict definition of a change in gene frequencies, there is no dispute that we are continuing to evolve. As long as humans are still producing children, we will be continuing to evolve in that sense. There's no way to dispute that. But what people actually mean when they ask the question, are we still evolving, usually has to do with natural selection. They want to know, are we still changing adaptively? You know, and for some of them, they're asking, are we going to get wings? But so I'm going to approach this from three angles. And I'm going to start by talking about the recent past of human evolution. Now, when I say recent past, of course, I'm talking more like 30 to 40,000 years, not last week. But I'm going to give you a few examples of how we have strong evidence of this occurring recently. Because there is a subset, like Gould, that thinks that about 40,000 years ago, it all stopped. Then I'm going to touch on some examples and forces acting on us now, right, today, on our current population. And I'm going to finish off with a few facts about short-term future for us, and a bit of speculation about the longer-term future. Let's start with the past. I'm going to come back to a Gould said, right? Because the key aspect of this here is that everything we call culture and civilization can be built with the same body and brain. And Gould is also saying that things like culture and the technology explosion in the Neolithic, our ability to use tools and the explosions in complexity of information that came from that, these things have taken over from natural selection. Because culture moves too fast. Natural selection can't keep up. Natural selection operates on the time of generations, which for humans can be hundreds to thousands of years. But culture, you can see massive changes as we have, in a few decades. So I'm gonna prove Gould wrong here. I'm gonna start with cheese. Okay? Hands up if you like cheese. Excellent. Now I'm curious to see what the response to this one's going to be. Hands up if you're lactose intolerant. Nobody in here? Two? All right. Excellent. In Western cultures, mostly European, North American because of the immigration, and of course here because of the immigration, most people aren't lactose intolerant. Right. Well, that's not the way we started out. Just for background, lactose is the main carbohydrate in milk, and so, of course, in cheese. And it's a major energy source for young mammals. Most mammals, when they're young, will take milk from a mother. But as they wean and they grow older, as they turn into juveniles and onto adults, they lose the ability to process milk. And once upon a time, so did we. Now, the ability to process milk comes from an enzyme called lactase, which is responsible for the hydrolysis of lactose into the lactose and glucose, which, you don't really need to know that. There won't be a quiz on this. But the interesting part of this is that young mammals express the genes for lactase, and they produce lactase, and then after a while it just drops off. Right? Now, the situation changed for us, right? Without this enzyme, mammals can't break it down, but somewhere along the line, we actually picked up a change, which means that we continue to express lactase throughout our entire lifespan. Right? So well into your old age, you can still enjoy a good block of cheese, without the embarrassing problems of lactose intolerance. And this actually shows some interesting characteristics as to where it arose. The red areas on this map, this is the distribution of lactase persistence, by which they mean retaining lactase well into your adult years. And the distribution of lactase persistence in the old world, where it evolved, shows some geographic aspects to it. You can see that Western Europe, it's got a very high frequency of this. So this is the frequency of the trait in the population. Red means that pretty much everybody has it. Blue means pretty much nobody has it. So you can see across the world this varies. Europe mostly has it, middling through the northern Asia. And then significant parts of Africa and India have it as well. But then there are huge blocks of area which tend not to. Yeah?
If you don't mind me just asking a question midway through, tell me if you don't want me to speak. I just wanted to ask you about Australia and New Zealand. Does that refer to native populations?
It's an average of the population.
Yeah. Native or post-European colonisation?
Altogether.
Oh, okay.
When you say old world, what period? 50,000, 40,000, 10,000, 5,000?
Now.
Oh, now?
Yeah. When we say old world, we just mean this area of the world, not in time.
And this is lactose intolerant.
No, this is lactase persistence.
Persistence.
So they retain the ability.
Yeah.
Sorry. So this actually points to some interesting things, which is actually the fact that lactase persistence came as a result of a cultural change. Right? And that cultural change was farming. Now, farming had a massive influence on human evolution. Right? That cultural innovation actually kicked off the evolution of lactase persistence in humans, because we can actually date the origin of this particular variant in humans back to about 7,500 to 8,000 years ago, when agriculture was taking off. In fact, in some cases, some variants of it can be specified down to a geographic region like the Central Balkans, right, or Northern Africa. And it actually fits quite well with the distribution that we saw on that map. So they've got, not only is there a very clear pattern of how this evolved over the last few thousand years, but it's also really tied to this cultural aspect, which Gould would say, well, you know, this doesn't happen, right? But in fact, he's wrong. Culture, in this case, actually accelerates evolution, right? It creates new selection pressures. Selection pressures is a technical term, basically to do with the fitness of various traits, right? But it creates new selection pressures which enhance the acquisition of this trait, instead of blocking it or decoupling it from natural selection. So that's one example of how this works. And I'm going to give you another. This is kind of cool. I could talk about this all night, but this is the case of the incredible shrinking brain. Now, most people have a picture in their heads of how brains and our general cognitive capacity has evolved. And it goes something like primates dumber than us, early humans somewhere in the middle, and we're the top of the rank. Right? And that actually is true, but you know, within certain limits. But one thing that people don't realize, and paleontologists have known this for a little while, but it hasn't really gotten out of the paleontological community, which is that in the last 10,000 years, our brains have actually shrank. Right? By actually a significant amount. It actually comes out to about 10%. Right?
Speak for yourself.
Now, see, that's actually an interesting response, because people assume that just because we have smaller brains, it means we're stupider. Well, you chuckle at that, but that is actually one strain of thought in the academic community, right? There are actually, even geneticists out there who think that we're dumber, partially because of this. And the fact is, almost certainly not, right? John Hawkes has a very strong argument saying that it's not that we have smaller brains, it's that they're more efficient, right? They get more done with less. Because really carrying around this big watermelon on our bodies is metabolically costly, right? We spend a large part of our energy budget just feeding this thing, right? So if we can make it run leaner, then that's going to be selected for, okay? But this is a fairly big chunk of endocrinal volume that's just gone.
Which is there a particular part of the brain? Is it like the frontal cortex is growing, presumably, another part of the brain?
Yeah, the relative dimensions, it's a tricky topic, because that does vary over time, as well as other things like gender, and I really don't want to get into that.
Very wise.
All right, I'll tell you the current thought. Women's brains are slightly smaller on average, but that doesn't mean anything, partially because you actually have more gray matter. Right? So it all comes out in the wash, really. I'm going to get lynched up here. Just strung up on a cross, that's probably not good. Sorry.
Sorry, but is it overall shrinking uniformly, in proportion, or is it, as you're saying, is it different parts of the brain, so shrinking more so than others?
It is.
In general.
It's a little hard to tell, because I mean, we have the brain casts, right? Like we have the skulls which demonstrate this, but we don't actually have the brains. So all we can do is kind of, it's a little weird, it's like pouring into the brain and seeing what the mold looks like. So there's evidence to suggest that the frontal cortex has actually enlarged relative to the rest of the body. But I'm not going to hang my hat on that. I can't believe I actually.
I'm here all week, different ways.
Yeah.
Excuse me, how many people were tested? What's the
Tested for
research result of this?
I'm not sure what you mean.
How can you prove this?
Well, because we have a series of fossils from throughout the relevant period from all over the world.
So you tested present people or rather dead people?
Well, yeah.
Yes.
I mean, so we have current fossils, not fossils, but corpses, right, that we can use to compare to previous fossil forms. So there's been this change in brain size, and that in alone, I mean, it's obviously an evolutionary response. Whether it's adaptive or not is another question. And there's actually some evidence to suggest that there is something to this. So there's a condition called microcephaly, which is a disorder in which it's usually either at birth or sometime after there's a reduction in brain size compared to the average normal of up to about 70%. Right? This is a really dramatic effect. It's huge. But associated with this disorder, as there often is, are some interesting genetic underpinnings. And a guy named Bruce Lon, I never know how to pronounce his name. He's at Harvard, I believe, but he's been looking at some genetics that go with this, including one particular variant of a gene called MPCH1, which is related to microencephaly. When you get a particular variant of this, you end up with microencephaly. But when they actually looked at the genomes over time, they found that there's a particular variant of this called haplogroup D, or haplotype D. It's probably hard to read in the back there, but this diagram actually shows the prevalence of this haplotype, which is just a fancy way of saying genes that are close together on the chromosome. But this particular variant shows a particular pattern of worldwide distribution. So these circles indicate the frequency of the trait in the sampled population. Forget the numbers, they just indicate which sample it was. They don't indicate anything about the value, but the little pie charts indicate how frequent that haplogroup D is in that population. So you can see in here it's 3/4 and above. Throughout Asia, it also maintains a high rate. Into North America, which would be following the path of human expansion, it approaches complete fixation. But in Africa, it's not very common. And Lon and his collaborators have suggested, partially based on this distribution and on the genomic data, that this trait actually arose in Western Europe about 37,000 years ago, and then spread with humans as we expanded across Asia and into North America. It's always one. Sorry, I'm dying. So here's another example of a trait that shows a very clear pattern of evolution in the recent human history. We can track it, we can plot it in nice little pictures, and it's just one of about, well, I can think of at least a dozen strong examples right off the top of my head, which follow patterns like this. They show strong signs of recent positive selection. When I say positive selection, I mean what normal people think of when they talk about evolution, a trait rising in the population and increasing in frequency because it's been selected. Right? So, I could spend all night going through these, and they're all really cool, but I want to move on because the past is pretty well established. But here's where people start to say, I don't know, right?
Can I just ask you something? When you talk about evolution, you think that evolving is something that's going to benefit the humankind, and with the gene of microcephaly, it's actually detrimental. So how do we work in terms of...
It's detrimental in a particular variant, right? If you stick with me for a while, I'm going to show you another example that will be very clear on how a trait like that can arise. So if you give me just a little while, I'm going to show you how that works, okay? Cool? My slides are actually out of order here. This was one I meant to show before. This is actually just a list of recent signals of selection that have been identified in genome-wide studies. And I've actually cut this off because it goes like right through the floor. Right? There's like 3 pages of this, and this is just a listing of some of the stuff they found. Right? Incidentally, this isn't me, if you can read that. I kind of wish it was, but it wasn't. But in any case, I want to move on to the present because there's some really interesting stuff going on in the present. And it does show the power of evolution still operating on us right now. But to do that, I'm going to go back to the story of farming. Right? Farming has been sometimes called the greatest mistake we ever made. Right? Because hunter-gatherers, I'm going to wildly generalize here, so if you know anything about this, please just give me the benefit of the doubt. But hunter-gatherers had it relatively easy in terms of food production. Okay? For the most part, their ability to gather calories was actually a lot better than really agriculturalists. So they could satisfy their food needs fairly quickly and then take the rest of the day off. Right? Casual Fridays had a whole new meaning for that. The introduction of farming was actually a step backwards in that regard. People had to work a lot harder, they died sooner, they started to get new and interesting diseases, many new and interesting diseases, because this is when a lot of the diseases we know today kicked off. But the main reason for this happening, of course, is that it drastically improved the actual percentage of calories we could get in a constrained area, and it increased population density. Right? So you could have more children, and so the trait spread, even though, we can look back and say, oh, why did you do that? But farming had other knock-on consequences. It had other effects. So early farmers in say, Africa, this picture's actually from France, but please, they started to clear the land. Sorry. They started to clear the land, and this had consequences of its own. They were reshaping the landscape, and when they did, it had effects that they couldn't predict. One of them was this: standing water, right? Stagnant water. Anybody have any idea what's going to come out of that? Right. You get this little bugger. All right. We get much greater conditions for mosquitoes. They don't actually do too well in heavily forested areas. At least their population density is a lot lower. But when the land was cleared, you get all these right conditions for mosquitoes, especially in the areas that agriculture began. Right? This guy is actually Anopheles albumanus, which is the vector in the Americas. But I just like this picture better than the African one. The African mosquito, Anopheles gambiae, had a serious problem for humans in store for us, which was, of course, some of you already realized, malaria. In particular, the most deadly form of malaria, Plasmodium falciparum. And so malaria, of course, it's a serious problem for humans around the world still. It causes a variety of problematic symptoms. They start off looking flu-like, and then you can get seizures, and in many cases you will actually wind up dead from this. In fact, the WHO reports in 2010 there were 660,000 deaths from malaria. These are a pair of Bengalese children standing in front of a bed net, right, which helps to reduce the incidence of malaria, which is, in some way the point, because malaria is preventable, right? That number could be 0, but it isn't. So, but this in itself imposes a huge selection pressure on people in these areas, right? And we're going to see the consequence of that. And this consequence is ongoing. It's happening right now. Right? This is hemoglobin. Right? I'm sure you're all familiar with this. Hemoglobin is the iron-containing oxygen transporting molecule in our body. And it's composed of 4 protein chains, 2 alphas and 2 betas. Nobody cares. But the interesting part is that, again, glossing into a lot of detail, we have 2 variants of interest for this talk, one of which is hemoglobin A, which is kind of the regular hemoglobin, and one is hemoglobin S, which contains a change in it's one of its beta chains, and it's recessive, right? So if both your parents contribute hemoglobin S to you, what you wind up with is sickle cell anemia, right? Which is not a great condition to have. Okay? It does increase mortality. It dramatically reduces your quality of life. You can see here, this is actually, the anemia part concerns the fact that the sickle cells, the red blood cells, tend to die early, right? So you end up with anemia, which is the definition of which is lack of red blood cells. Kind of circular there. But you can also get plenty of conditions like this where the sickle cells impede normal blood flow, which leads to pain and crises, and all sorts of problems that come with this. So what we would expect, as the question you posed earlier, why does this trait persist? Right? Why do people have it? And you see an uneven distribution of this across the world. In Northern Europe, they have sickle cell anemia. Right? Its prevalence is basically 0. Hemoglobin S just doesn't get carried there. North America, except for a few obvious exceptions, like slaves that were brought over from Africa, the prevalence of this is effectively 0 as well. But in places like Western Africa, right, the prevalence approaches 25%. And in other parts of Africa and into India, you see it at high levels too. But if this is such a problem, why does it persist? And the answer can be seen in this bug crawling up the screen. No, I only wish. It's actually in this plot, and it's a little hard to read, so I'm going to break it down for you. This actually shows an example of how this affects people. So if you are an individual who happens to have a AA genotype, so neither of your parents contributed hemoglobin S, this is kind of a measure of fitness, so we're just talking in relative terms here, but relatively speaking, you perform somewhere in the middle, right? You are affected by malaria, it's not great. If you have SS, your life is worse, right? You die quickly, and of course you also have sickle cell anemia, so sucks to be you. However, if you have one of each, you do better than either of the homozygotes. This is what's known as heterozygote advantage. All right? And it actually leads to a form of evolution that we call balancing selection. It can also be called purified selection if you're mixing terms. So balancing selection works to maintain the trait in the population. Right? In this case, it's because the heterozygotes do better. Right? If you have an A and an S, you actually outperform the other two. Right? If you happen to be the unlucky one who gets both S's, sorry. But in the meantime, the trait is maintained in the population by this evolutionary force. And this is going on today. Right? The interesting part of this is that this actually arose several times independently. Right? So this mutant evolved at least 4 times. Senegal, Benin, Central Africa, and Indian populations, and spread in those populations on their own. Right? And before you ask me, well, what happens if you take care of malaria? That actually will lead to evolution itself. Because now, if there's no malaria, then the trait will lose all of its adaptive significance. and it'll start to decline in the population. And that in itself is an evolutionary response, which unfortunately we can't really move as fast with technology. It would take generations to go away. So people would still be suffering from sickle cell anemia in these parts of the world for decades, if not much longer. But of course, evolution would be acting to change that. So that's an example of a trait that's being maintained in the population right now. And I'm going to switch now to another story which shows how, if not novel, but strong forces may be acting upon us right now. And this is a story that saddens me a lot. So I had to lead off with a cute picture of a baby, because what comes after this kind of sucks, right? Which is this. It's the gender gulf in China. So right now, this shows the evolution of this over time. There's a cultural preference for boys in China, coupled with the one-child policy, which kicked off in about 79, I believe it was the first implementation of it. And over time, the disparity in, and this is at adulthood, but the disparity in men and women in terms of sex ratio of the population grew. So today, there's 52 million missing women in China. Women that should have been there and weren't. Right? Human sex ratios tend to stick pretty close to parity, equal numbers of men and women. Now there's a lot of really good reasons for this. And the evolutionary theory behind this goes back to the 30s with R.A. Fisher. But this is actually a really strong evolutionary force that acts on the sex ratio. So for this to be out of whack is actually a strong cultural effect. Right? But that cultural effect is going to then change the selection pressures that people in these countries face. Because it's not just China. Right? Rob Brooks, my colleague at the University of New South Wales, talks about this a fair bit. And he's pretty fired up about this issue. So this is from a paper he wrote last year showing the missing women in a variety of countries. China has it the worst, but it's not looking too great in some other countries as well, including India, South Korea, Taiwan, and I mean, it's getting better in Pakistan and Iran and Afghanistan, but still, the sex ratios are still skewed there. And, putting aside the issue of where did the women go, you might say, well, so what? Right? I hope you don't, but you might say that. You might pose the question, well, so the sex ratio is skewed. Okay, what does that mean? Well, unfortunately, this is going to impact our evolutionary pressures. We start off with infanticide. Right? We know this is occurring. The United Nations has been screaming about this for quite a while. They're really not happy about it, and I don't blame them. This in turn leads to reproductive skew. Now, reproductive skew is basically a term that means I'm a guy in China, my chances of getting married are a lot less now because I'm competing for 52 million women that aren't there. Right? I'm now in competition with all these extra men, which, if you attended Peter's talk, right, you'll recognize as a form of sexual selection. And sexual selection is natural selection on the genders. Right? So this is going to push around the evolutionary forces on men in these countries, and on women too. Women's lives in these situations, they don't, you might think, oh well, they have all these extra suitors. Not so much, right? The resulting male conflict that comes out of this tends to leave women in a much worse position. Right? And I'm not going to get into the full details of that. You can, if you ask me later, I'll give you a pointer to Rob's book. He's got a good deal on this. But this leads to a lot of extra men with a lot of extra time and no reproductive stake. Right? They can't reproduce, so they start to take risks. Right? In the animal world, you end up with aggressive conflict. You end up with sexual dimorphism. So you have elephant seals in the southern part of the world, the southern elephant seals, which show this massive disparity between men and women. The males are 4 to 5 times larger than the females. And they engage in these bloody conflicts, and they control harems of women. The females are basically just lying around for the one male. Right? So it completely skews the reproductive society in that situation. And the results in humans? This is actually from South Korea, but same idea. Just in case anybody recognizes it, I might say, that's not that. But historically, when this has arisen, it's led to wars. It's led to higher risk-taking behavior of men. It's led to more crime. It's led to basically worse outcomes for everyone involved. Now, this extra mortality that comes along with this is an evolutionary pressure in and of itself. And so are the sexual selection pressures. Now, I can't predict exactly what those are going to be right now, right? Because we don't know. But the implications are still clear. Something is going to happen. Right? And that is evolutionary in nature. And that story sucks, right? And I hate having to tell it, but it's a really strong effect going on and will continue to go on in China for quite some time and in these other countries around the world. It's inescapable until they get out from under the rock and start changing their sex ratio. Right? Which should, if the cultural effect goes away, should come back on its own. But we'll see what happens. So, I'm doing quite good on time actually, which is good since, frankly, it's hell in here. But I'm going to take a step to the future now. And I'm going to deal with the short-term future first. And by now, hopefully I've convinced you that, either I've convinced you that evolution has happened and is still happening to humans, or I've intrigued you enough to go find it on your own. And now here I'm going to try and do the same thing for the near future in humans, and then I'm going to leave you with some speculative thoughts to keep you going for the long-term future. So is human evolution finished? Right? So we have doctors, we have technology. Theoretically, nobody, well, we say nobody dies from causes they shouldn't, but as we'll see in a second, that's actually not really true. But here's one view of what might be going on in the near future in human evolution. Okay? This is one example story. Okay? And this story starts in a little lakeside town in northern Italy, whose name is Limone sul Garda. And I'm pretty sure I just mangled that pronunciation, which is okay because I think I said it softly enough, nobody heard it anyways. But, beautiful place, right? And researchers in the 1980s were, for some reason, wandering around this town. I want to go to that conference. And they stumbled upon this guy who, and I still don't know how they found him, I'm trying to find out, but this guy's really kind of weird because he had extremely low levels of HDL, which is the good cholesterol, right? And his blood was just rampant with triglycerides, right? And he was well into middle age, but when they examined him, he showed absolutely zero sign of heart disease. Nothing, right? His parents lived to a ripe old age, despite having essentially the same diet and everything else, the same profiles. They looked across the town and they found 43 people in total who had this blood profile like this guy did. And none of them had any sign of heart disease. And so the researchers are sitting there going,
Sorry, none of them had what?
they had no signs of heart disease. Right? Despite all having the same blood profile, low HDL, high triglycerides in the blood, basically a heart attack waiting to happen. Right? And yet none of them are showing any of the ill effects. Why not? Well, they actually traced all 43 people back through the local birth records to a single couple that got married in 1780. All right? And this is, their names are Giovanni Pomeroli and Rosa Giovanelli. I've seen a photo of them. They're a really cute couple. But one of them had a mutation. All right? And this was a mutation in a protein, APOI, apolipoprotein I, and it's the first one, and it's the Milano variant, they're called it now. If you go troll around the internet, you'll actually see that there's a lot of pharmaceutical companies which are madly trying to make this work in synthetic forms for humans, right? Because this thing is amazing. It's basically a scrubber for your arteries, right? If you have this floating right in your blood, it wipes out cholesterol like it's not even there. Right? So why am I telling you this story? I'm talking about the future, right? What? And yes, I'm Canadian, so I had to throw that in there. Actually, this was, believe it or not, this was the best picture of McDonald's I ever found for free. But here's another cultural effect, which is changing our selective pressures, right? Heart disease is on the rise. You know, I could probably stand to lose a few myself. Right? I've eaten at McDonald's too often. And this variant in this little town in Italy increased from 1 copy 10 generations ago to 43 copies in the space of, like I said, 10 generations. All over the world, there are people with variants which may be affected by these types of selective pressures. Again, Rob Brooks at UNSW has spent a lot of time looking at what we eat and how it's affecting us in evolutionary terms. Right? And you can see some really strong effects. There's actually, okay, I'm going to ask you a question, right? And answer honestly. Who are the fattest people in the world?
The what? The fastest or the fattest?
The fattest. Who are the most overweight people in the world? Americans.
The Americans and the Germans.
You're all wrong. All right? I know. It's easy because we've been led to believe that, especially as North Americans, we're told we're all horribly fat, and we are. But we're not actually the fattest people on Earth. Right? The most obese people on Earth actually are Polynesian islanders. All right? And you think, oh, you know, island paradise, they must be doing pretty good for themselves. But what's actually happened is that Western food has been introduced into their environment, and they show no ability to process it. Right? They get obese at a massive rate. On some of the islands, their obesity rates are 80 or 90%. Right? This is a huge effect, but people in Western cultures have a little more protection, right? And I can't go into all the details here, but there's strong evidence that this is actually an evolved response that followed the introduction of agriculture that I talked about earlier, spreading across the world. Right? So European cultures and North American cultures do actually have a little more protection. I mean, we still get obese if we eat too much, but compared to these Polynesians who've never experienced this for tens of thousands of years, we do a lot better than they do. Right? And there are other pressures, selective pressures, that are continuing to hammer at us. Right? We think of medicine as solving all our problems, but it's not true. Right? This is actually just a really nice picture of salmonella. I know, a nice picture of salmonella. Who said that? All right. I'm just going to keep you in the corner if that's okay. But we're constantly exposed to pathogens that are trying to kill us. Right? We're in an arms race constantly. I work on viral evolution, and this stuff scares the bejesus out of me. There's, although incidentally, I mean, I should put some of this in perspective. If you're the kind of person who worries about like bioterrorism or something escaping from the lab, that's not really where you should be looking, right? You should look at the hamburger you just ate, because the amount of subclinical antibiotics introduced into farming practice has led to the breeding of, well, what we call superbugs, but I kind of hate that term. That it's multiply antibiotic-resistant bacteria, right, which are flourishing in these animal reservoirs and just waiting for the chance to take a crack at us. Right? So we are locked in this war. Influenza, right? The 2009 H1N1, which people think that actually was kind of a failed pandemic, but I mean the truth is that it was a really scary disease. Most of the people in this room who are, of say in the 20 to 45 age bracket, you were actually at the highest risk from H1N1, which is normally not the case. You know, influenza deaths usually come in the elderly, immunocompromised, and very young. But it was killing healthy, young adult people at a disproportionately high rate, something like 30% of the deaths. Right? Highly pathogenic avian influenza is still circulating in H5N1 form in China, and it's waiting to jump out and have a go at us too. Spanish flu in 1918 killed 50 to 100 million people. That was more than everyone who died of World War I together. And those genotypes are still circulating. Now, I'm not trying to paint a horrible picture. We're not all going to die of flu tomorrow, okay? But these things continue to impose a whole bunch of selective pressure on us. Norovirus kills thousands across the world. We think of it as a fairly benign disease you get when you go on a cruise. You know, it's also called Norwalk virus. You know, you always hear about it on our cruise ships or at resorts where people, you know, they get stuck and then they puke for 2 weeks. But that amount of diarrhea and vomiting in an impoverished country is fatal.
Would that be a cure for obesity?
I've heard some weird cures for obesity, including botfly maggots in your skin.
Oh, that puts you off your food.
Yeah, a little bit. But I don't think norovirus has ever been seriously proposed. Although I do have a colleague that if you ever get sick with it, please tell me because he would love to sample you. Wow, that sounded really creepy. Multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, starting to pop up. MRSA, methicillin-resistant Streptococcus aureus, right? This kills 18 to 20,000 people a year in the US, I believe. You get it mostly when you go into the hospital. Right? A little counterproductive. SARS, again, another one that killed the young and the healthy and just about got away from us. Pertussis, whooping cough, measles, mumps, rubella, all of the things that we can vaccinate against, and people who don't vaccinate. Because these are coming back. They're at epidemic level now in the US and the UK, all across the world. These things are starting to kill children again. Right? They were, sorry, I don't want to get onto that. But they kill. Right? And killing is a reduction in fitness, and reduction in fitness is an evolutionary pressure. And unless we forget, natural disasters happen all the time, and when they do, not only do you die from things that happen during the disaster, but you die from things that happen afterwards. Even if you are in a well-stocked nation, but Haiti obviously wasn't, and the cholera outbreak there is still ongoing. It's actually killed over 8,000 people already, and they're still having trouble getting it under control. Interestingly, actually, the cholera outbreak, it did some really cool genetic work on that and showed that it actually came from Nepal. That it was Nepalese peacekeepers who had it and went to help in Haiti and kicked off the epidemic. Right? Air travel for the win. Now, I say all this, and we are locked in this war with these pathogens. And if you actually look at the human genome and you look at first these signals of selection, you will see a lot of signals related to immune response and to basically our ability to fight these things. Because we're continually in an arms race. They evolve, we evolve. So I say that anthropomorphically, like there's somebody out of controls, but it's a continual cycle. From the viruses and the bacteria's point of view, this is called the Red Queen hypothesis. On the upside, I can end on an up note, right? Our ability to respond to this and our ability to evolve in general has actually never been greater, right? Because human genetic diversity has never been greater. So this is actually this is the plot of a series of populations across the world, looking at their what's called the affected population size. I'm not really going to deal with that term, but in case you know what it is, it's the affected population size, not the census population. But this is looking at it this is from Mealy et al. 2012, and it's looking at the ancestral population size. So this is, I forgot the exact date. I think it's about 40K years ago is the dating on this. Now they were looking at it from a how did we evolve out of Africa type situation, right? And what this actually shows is that the effective population size was higher in Africa than in Europe and Asia. But the key point of this is that population sizes then were small, right? Small populations have a reduced ability to respond to evolutionary pressures. They're subject more to a process known as genetic drift, in which they lose genetic variability. And if I haven't put you to sleep already, that might. But this is human population size now, right? It has increased into the billions, right? And this is actually a projection of the population models for the next few decades. I believe this is from the UN data, showing the 3 population models they work on. And so either our population is going to start to decline, or it's going to level out at about 6 to 7 billion, or it's actually going to climb up to about, there's a number, I think it was, in total it's 16. Incidentally, in case nobody's actually told you this yet, we don't really have a population problem, which may come as a surprise. What we have is a resource problem. Fertility rates across the world have gone into the toilet. In most developed nations, we're well below replacement fertility. Right? Even other developing nations like China, for example. China's total fertility rate at this point is 1.55. 2 is replacement fertility. 2 kids per woman. Right? So all over the world, populations are starting to decline. So population growth will probably solve itself before it destroys us. The problem is that we all use way too many resources. Right? The amount of resource use per individual sitting in this room, like the collected resource use in this room could probably take care of a fairly small African nation, but still, like you're disproportionate users of resources. But that's another rant for another day. And why am I bringing up population size? Well, it's because of this. It's because of the replication of DNA, right? Which, the most important part of this is the little molecule called DNA polymerase, which is responsible, and again, if you're a biochemist, or like a biologist, I'm skipping over a lot of detail here, but it's kind of the key player in our replication. And for this purposes, it sometimes makes mistakes. And mistakes are mutations. I'm going to run a little bit of math to close this off. All right. Human genome has 3.2 billion base pairs. We have a mutation rate of about 1.0 times 10 to the minus 9, which is about 1 in a billion. So about every billion bases, our polymerase makes an error. So that comes out as a mutation. That's the low estimate. The high estimate is about 2.3 times 10 to the minus 8. When you work that out, multiplying our mutation rate by our genome size, and the fact that you get 2 genomes, 1 per parent, you end up with about 6 mutations per person. Right? So everybody in this room has, on average, 6 mutations. Right? Some are more, some are less. Many are deleterious. Humans have a fairly high rate of spontaneous abortion. Right? There's a good reason for this. At the high, these are estimates of human mutation rates, which they kind of vary a bit because it's kind of hard to measure this. But so the low end is about 6, and the high end is about 150 per person. Right? Now we scale that up to the total population. About the figures I was looking at, 6.9 billion as of mid-2010, which led us with 3.6 billion of reproductive age. We wind up with about somewhere between 20 to 530 billion mutations per generation. Right? This is a massive pool of genetic diversity. Right? And our ability to respond evolutionarily, mutation is the fuel of evolution. It's the introduction of new information which evolution acts upon, and the tank has never been full. So, I've covered a fair bit about how humans may evolve. I've tried to focus on this aspect and ignore the other forces to some extent. And I'm, of course, missing a slide here. One of the last thing I'm going to leave you with is a thought for the future. Right? I can demonstrate, I think pretty convincingly, that we're going to continue to evolve, at least for the short term. And the short term could be a few decades, it could be a few centuries, right? Depending on how our technology progresses. People who try to predict technology almost always fail, so I'm not going to try to do that. There's a good saying that if you're a psychologist or a biologist, at some point in your life you have to write the sentence, humans are smarter than monkeys because, and then you just hope that you die before the monkey proves you wrong. And it's the same thing with technology. Making pronouncements is doomed to failure. So, you have people like Ray Kurzweil, who talks about the singularity. Frankly, I think he's full of it. I don't think he knows a thing about biology, but let's say he's right. Okay, in 50 years, we all get uploaded into computers, and that's it. In that case, yeah, evolution is pretty much stopped. Right? But until something of that magnitude happens, we're still evolving. I can't tell you how. It's like a lightning strike. Right? We know they're going to happen, but I can't tell you where. Unless I'm a really good atmospheric physicist. But so it's unpredictable, but it's going to happen. And so I'd like to thanks for your attention.
Any questions, I guess?
Well, aren't we effectively going to be make the lightning rod for the lightning by just about genes?
So
ultimately, we're going to take control and start messing around with genes more directly.
Unlike what they show you in movies, that's not going to happen anytime soon.
Well,
Right? But it could happen. You're right. And if that did
in the
happen,
next 500 years, it probably will.
probably, but I wouldn't hazard a guess as to when.
No.
Right. We've sequenced the human genome, for instance, but we don't really actually know much about how it works. The human people complain about the fact that the Human Genome Project hasn't paid off, and the fact is that all we have is the map. We don't know what any of the places are labeled, and we don't know where they go. So that technology is still a ways off. But you're right. If it did emerge, then that could mess with our. We could have unintended consequences too. Right? We could send the wheels off, basically.
Hi, great, interesting, and I think you've proved reasonably well evolution is still happening. But the question, and you touched on it with the norovirus, natural selection is being thwarted surely by human technology. As you say, Westerners, because they have the rehydration, will survive the norovirus, the Africans perhaps will not. So natural selection isn't functioning normally under this environment. Isn't that going to change the outcome of
You might think that, but actually population structure like that. So the Africans in this case, I'm going to generalize again hugely, but they form, you can think of them as one population, Westerners and the other. Right? So in that case, the selective pressures are acting differently. Norovirus doesn't have a big effect in the Western nations, but in Africa it's going to have pretty severe selective pressure. And that will change gene frequencies in Africa, which by migration can then enter other population centers. Right? So gene flow can actually work around that problem. And it's an evolutionary force that we talk about much, but it is actually quite powerful.
thanks to aeroplanes, possibly?
Well, partially. Although you'd be surprised because when they actually look at where people get married and reproduce, even today it's actually very local. Right? Most people will still marry and reproduce very close to where they were born. We're talking maybe 100 kilometers at most. And it falls off very, very much like that. I don't have much time there. I don't want to.
Oh, no, that's fine.
That's okay, I'll sort of
Couple more
figure out
questions.
how to make it work.
Yeah, come on.
Yep.
Sex ratio skewing in China. I don't believe it's going to happen for a moment, but what if the governments encourage male homosexuality as a possible solution?
That would be an interesting policy to see them implement.
I don't think it'll be their first option. They are pragmatic.
Given their penchant for enforcement, I'd like to see the bureau responsible for that.
You can put in all sorts of welfare encouragement schemes.
According to the party, if you don't.
I think it either turns you on or doesn't.
Well, we all know, for instance, that say men in prisons are more likely to
faculty of homosexuality. That's still a little unclear as to
Absolutely.
how that actually works, but yeah, I mean,
Could strategies like that be used to address the situation?
What is it achieve, really?
Could evolution be driven on
Like
geographic
a sexual,
distance, so that you get one
sexual
region?
conflict and stuff.
yeah, very stories. That's similar to Nora's question. That's going to be happening all over the world because of the differences in technology. So some regions are going to be experiencing much different selection pressures, and you'll see different evolutionary responses. I didn't really quite answer your question. If that were to
Strategies
arise,
like that.
I mean, I would hope that we could get that because that would vastly improve the situation of women in China. Right? If that were to happen, then the changes in evolutionary pressures would follow suit. Right? Because one-to-one sex ratio is our basically our natural state. So here's hoping.
One last question.
Just with keeping more babies alive and things that have genetic problems and to reproductive age, how is that affecting our evolution, do you think?
I'd like to give you a clear answer to that, but we don't know. Right?
Making us more fragile physically?
Yes. But
or antibiotics and all those sort of things that are keeping more people alive.
that is one area in which I'm really hesitant to speculate, right? Because it's almost a question of chaos, right? What are the unintended consequences of this? So, keeping more people alive when they would have normally died, yes, it may change, so it changes infant mortality, which may remove a source of selection. But it may say, maybe one of them grows up to create a cultural influence, which does affect our evolution in turn. So we're going to have to measure that over the next few generations to see what happens. My guess is that it actually won't have as big an effect as you'd like to think. Infant mortality is a huge problem, but we still see clear signals of selection in humans, even though infant mortality dropped in many populations in the last couple hundred years. Right? It's called the demographic transition in sociology. And so we didn't really see a huge reduction in signals of selection over that time period. The signals are a little hard to read at that resolution, but my guess is that would still continue.
Okay.